right now in this world, there isn't an alternative for people. You either go to one supermarket or the other. So we want to become part of that alternative if possible. We had to create something that was about dignity as well. So we took surplus food, we placed a price on it, and people were more willing to pay for it than they were to come and get it potentially for free, which was really, really, really interesting from my perspective psychologically. In a world where I passionately argue against that we shouldn't have companies like us around, but there is a need and a space for us right now to do what we do until there comes a time where we're not needed, or we are needed to the point where we have to sit around that table and play a major part in the discussion around food and food accessibility and supply chain management, production and seasonality and sustainability, everything that's involved in food. We need to be sat around that table and saying, look, we may have millions of people accessing us on a daily basis. And so therefore you may need to look at how you support these kind of much more local, sustainable food systems that are much about the communities rather than about the shareholders. If we can shift supply and demand away from the retailers, they won't be able to afford to have so much wastage in their systems.
I'm delighted to share this conversation that I had earlier this week with Adam Smith. Adam brings a fabulous perspective on the food system, which comes from years of witnessing the enormous problem of food waste and exploring various angles trying to address it. Issues in the food system are complex, to say the least, but Adam brings a clarity through his determination to find the root cause of all of this waste. Do check the description for more information about Adam and the social enterprise he's founded and shares about here, Surplus to Purpose. I'm Helen Fisher. This is We Are Carbon, and throughout Season 4 you'll find new weekly conversations as we keep digging deeper and explore what it means to step into regenerative actions within our own place, creating health and vitality for ourselves, our communities, and the natural world around us. And really, igniting a new zest for life. Be sure to subscribe to keep up to date, and check the description for more opportunities to become involved. Enjoy the conversation. Hi Adam, thank you so much for joining us. It's a real pleasure to have you here, and I wonder if you could kick us off with a quick introduction to yourself and a little bit of a summary of the story of Surplus to Purpose.
Sure, yeah, morning Alan. My name's Adam, I'm the founder of Surplus to Purpose. I stop food from going to waste and I redistribute that across the world. Surplus to Purpose was born out of a previous project I founded, which was the Real Junk Food Project, and that was kind of that ended pretty much because of COVID. It caught up with it, and then Surplus to Purpose was born kind of post-COVID world, which obviously is very, very different, and that's the reason why it exists today, is to kind of facilitate surplus food in a way that's much more kind of commercially accessible and supportive to communities than it was under the kind of previous guys.
Brilliant. So this really is a topic about the food system and being kind of really so much waste, so much extreme amounts of waste in that food system. And I think it's this stark contrast. It's not just the waste, it's the other side of that picture that is the insecurity around food and the food poverty that just seems to really scream of a picture of a broken system. To have food that's going to waste and people that are going hungry, really definitely a broken system. Could you maybe share a few insights about how big a problem food waste is in the UK?
Sure. So you mentioned broken system, but having seen what I've seen over the last 12 years, I'd say it worked perfectly well. The system, it overproduces and it has a demand for need. And in the middle, somebody makes a lot of profit and is able to continue, because I truly believe that if it was broken and it didn't work for the people that needed it to work, then it wouldn't exist. And therefore, the way that we see it, whether that's morally, environmentally, socially, financially, however we look at it, it looks like a system that shouldn't be able to succeed. And it to me, it's a paradox. We have overproduction, we have surplus to requirements, we have inflated food prices, we have people that go without. Over 1 billion people on the planet don't have access to food, and yet we grow 6,000 calories per person per day worldwide. So something you would say is fundamentally wrong, but for those that are probably at the heart of it, or maybe the 1% at the top of it, it probably works perfectly well. And as a species, as a society, as local communities, we see the issues with it. And because it's so paradoxical and so complex, it's very, very hard for us to come up with a single answer or a solution which will work across the whole spectrum of food and food waste. And therefore, we'll never achieve it. We'll never achieve the ending of food waste. We'll never achieve overproduction or wastage, because it's a fundamental part of how that system is meant to behave. And for people like me and potentially you, Helen, that's really hard to see, and it's really hard to kind of understand and grasp, because I'm neurodivergent. I see the world in a black and white way, and for me the food system is very grey. And it's not just the fact that we waste too much food, it's the fact that we continuously and infinitely make anything, food related items, packaging, pallets, plastic wrapping, everything that's associated with it, with finite resources and with nowhere for the end result to go. There's only so many landfills and anaerobic digestion sites and redistribution channels and charities and people in need that we can continue passing the responsibility to before it comes to the point where something will implode and the system will need to take a step back in order to carry on, or it'll continue as it is and something will go fundamentally wrong, whether that's force majeure, whether that's weather, whether that is war, whether that's logistics, a pandemic. There's so many things that are out of our control that we have no full understanding of, and yet we still try to constantly achieve year-on-year growth in a finite world. So, yeah, I apologise for being negative, but the system isn't broken. The system is working perfectly well. The problem is that the system at some point, probably in our lifetime, will implode. Something will go wrong, and it'll be us that'll be left to pick up the pieces, unless, from a grassroots perspective, we change things from the bottom up. And that's the only way I can see this working.
Thank you. That's been really interesting, actually, because you're right. The system works in an extraordinarily wonderful way, in the sense that it's a commercial system, and it's channeling and it's using money and it's creating growth for those that are designing it. And I think also there has to be a little nod to the success of it, in that we are kind of creating a convenience. There's a food system where people can go to the shop and they can get products that are in shiny packages that have come from all across the globe, and they don't have to go out and forage from the trees and dig things up. So there are so many things about it that are successful, both for the consumer but also for that big system of commerce that's been designed. So absolutely take your point there. The system works the way that it's designed to, but it perhaps is going to not continue to do so because there's an issue with resilience.
But there's an issue with the fact that sustainability, you can't sustain infinite growth on finite resources. I think that's just a physical impossibility. There's no law out there that says that's ever going to be achieved. So it's not even like an opinion, or it's a matter of fact. Like that will happen at some point in some way, shape, or form. And we're so naive to think that that's not going to happen. We've only got a certain amount of space and resources on this planet that will allow us to continue doing that, unless we decide to put something back into it and give back and stop destroying or overproducing or carrying out globalization of all sorts of forms of logistics and supply chain management. Then something will give. Like, as a consumer as well, the responsibility is passed on to us, Helen. Like, it's our fault that there's food waste. It's our fault that there's plastic in the ocean. It's our, but there's no responsibility from the industry whatsoever to say, well, I never asked as a consumer for strawberries 365 days a year from any single supermarket anywhere in the UK. probably across Europe as well. But yet it's there. And then when there's wastage or prices go up or whatever it is that's affecting a single product, it then becomes the consumer's problem, the consumer's fault. This is what you wanted, this is what we gave you, and it's your fault. There's so much waste. When I constantly go on about and say there may be a lot of waste within household environments, but you're just passing the narrative and responsibility onto the consumer rather than taking responsibility further up the supply chain, where we could do a lot more about the issues. But they'll never will, because people will still continue to keep shopping and spending money 24/7 and buying things that are out of season and unsustainable and travel all over the world, including animal protein, which, regardless of your beliefs or your dietary requirements, it still plays a major part in things that are going wrong in this world, from cutting down of trees, but also the other side of the problem to the wastage that's involved in creating such vast amounts of animal protein. And so if we continue to allow the industry to not take responsibility and accept it as consumers, then nothing will ever change, because we'll constantly strive to try and do things like, don't fill up your kettle, because you're wasting too much energy, and yet they're just destroying thousands of pallets of perfectly edible food out of sight. It's like, well, what difference is it going to make if I boil my kettle or not, in comparison to what you're actually doing to the planet out of sight? So I constantly try to remind people and keep people back to where, they should be in terms of their focus. It's like, don't start shifting the narrative or responsibility away from your role in this, because you create these products, you create plastic bottles, you create products that people don't need or don't want, and then you flood the market with them, and then you expect us to deal with the responsibility of all of that, including the consumption of it, which sometimes, like I said, it's physically impossible when we're growing and making 6,000 calories per person per day globally. So how is that possible? How is it that a billion people go without? So yeah, I constantly keep saying to people, and we've got to stay true to the actual root cause here, and not start going off on trying to plaster cracks and trying to come up with solutions ourselves, because it's not our fault.
Yeah, I think that's really well said and so important. And it reminds me of something that you said when we got introduced to each other, and I'm going to quote you, and please forgive me if I take this a little bit out of context, but I think it's really important. You said to me, I don't like sustainability, it doesn't work for businesses. And I'm going to give you a chance to kind of correct me if I've phrased that wrong. But I absolutely loved what you said, because I completely agree, and I think it's the wrong message. And I think that the consumer and the small business focusing on these little steps of being sustainable really isn't where we should be putting our focus. So I'm just going to hand that to you and say, could you explain what you mean and what's behind that?
Yeah, I mean, if you think about where some of the narratives come from, so I know we're talking about food waste, but plastic plays a massive role in food waste in terms of packaging, etc. But plastic recycling and the whole efforts around reducing plastic consumption and single-use plastics, that all came from the oil industry. So the oil industry actually created that narrative, which then people jumped onto. So they thought, oh, this is great, we're going to reduce plastic. But yet in 2024, we produce more single-use plastic than ever before as a race on this planet. And yet we've got rid of disposable bags and plastic straws and cutlery, etc. And yet we're still producing more single-use plastic than ever before. So the industry likes to control that narrative regardless of what end of the spectrum that you're on. So it's exactly the same with food and food waste. The people that are playing a major role in creating the amount of food that's being wasted also are sat around that table supporting that narrative. And that goes all the way through to the third sector. There's people within the third sector that support the third sector that are sat in the commercial industry that are also controlling that narrative. I won't mention names, but there are retailers that lobby government, and those retailers then redistribute their surplus to certain third sector organisations, and those third sector organisations keep repeating this narrative around the rise of use of food banks and how much poverty there is in the country. So there seems to be a need for the demand, but it's all controlled by the people that are in the heart of the issue. For me, sustainability winds me up massively, because I did a speech recently in a place up north that had a lot of people in the room that was affiliated with the North Sea oil rigs. And I was kind of unprepared. I didn't really know the audience, but when I got to speak to people, I started realizing that they also had their own version of sustainability. And so they were talking about reduction of certain things and controlling flares, the oil rigs and et cetera, et cetera. And I kept thinking, but yet you're still just digging up the earth and, extracting oil, which then goes on to fuel cars and everything else and still destroys the planet. But you're kind of hanging on to this tiny little thread of hope that you are somehow achieving sustainability. And sustainability for them was like better than the previous year, not necessarily an overarching view of how they were operating. And that's when it made me. I just realized it's just nonsense. We have these narratives that come out around. I think in 2012, when I started, there was around 15 million tons of food waste that were generated in the UK every year. I think that's something down to like 8 million now, and people see it as a reduction of how much we're wasting. But actually, we're wasting more than ever before. What's happened is that there's more redistribution of surplus food. They've found ways to commercialize it. So there's a lot of people now selling surplus food before it makes it to waste through apps like Too Good To Go and other commercial avenues for them. I know that there's one of the biggest bread producers in the UK now claims to be zero waste, and it's not because they're not waste anymore. It's because they now sell it to create animal food out of all of their surplus rather than donating it. They found a way of making it into an income stream. So they claim to be zero waste, but they're still wasting. It's just the way that they've kind of structured that narrative around their waste. And so the more you look into it, the more you actually look at the root cause of what's really going on. When you look at, I'm obviously involved massively in food waste, and I work with a lot of organisations that created products out of surplus. So there's people that are making beer out of surplus, making condiments out of surplus, snack foods, for example, out of surplus products. There's a drinks company that makes it out of surplus. And I remember I was on a Google Hangout with about 50 organizations that were like startups and businesses that were using surplus, and they wanted me to go on there as a kind of a judging panel. And I was the only person that kind of stopped and went, so just a quick question to all you guys, like what happens when food waste stops tomorrow? What are you going to do with your business? And every single one of them turned around to me and said, but food waste isn't going to stop tomorrow. And it made me realize that nobody really wanted food waste to stop, but they wanted to go out and say that they were stopping food waste. And I said, but if all of us come together and stop it tomorrow, it just ends. That's it. It's gone. Surely that's a good thing. And you can all close your doors and say we're not needed anymore. And every single one of them had a look of shock on their face of like, but what's going to happen to our business? I was like, but you've created a business off the back of a problem. And if that problem is no longer there, then you're no longer needed. That's a good thing. That's the way that I've built our business. If we're not needed anymore, I'll close the doors tomorrow and I'll say, that's it, we're done. I have no problem with that whatsoever. Yes, obviously there's HR issues and things that you have to deal with internally. I get all that, bloody talking to company's house. But the single goal was to put ourselves out of business and be no longer needed. And it's really, really hard because we've become so dependent from the public who need us and people who want us to be there because we're doing a good thing. But you've got to constantly keep telling people, remember, we're here because there's a problem and not because we want to be here or because I went out one day and created a product or a service. I'm trying to focus everybody on the problem. So when you look at sustainability as a concept, the only true form of sustainability is Mother Nature. She knows how to balance the planet. She knows how to create. She knows what happens in terms of when things are no longer needed, and how it gets recycled back into that system. It's a continuous loop of creation and destruction of sort. Even when you see like wildfires and everything else that comes with it, it's all there for a purpose. It's there for a reason. It might seem drastic, but it's there to create life effectively. And there is no way that we can achieve anything close to that. So when I go to businesses and they say, oh, I've created a new business that's created a product that's going to be more sustainable. And I say to them, the only way that you can achieve that is by not having the business, because then you'll have no company, you'll have no vehicles, you'll have no supply chain. Can't keep making things and claiming to be sustainability. That's not how it works. You can't create a product and sell it and claim it's sustainable or ethical because you're doing a certain thing with it, because the fact that you're there means that you're not sustainable. We need to work more with nature and more understand the balance of that in order to work better. Like if we were going to do that, we'd work seasonally. we wouldn't work 24 hours, 365 days a year, because that's not sustainable. So it's hard for me sometimes to like say to people, I get what you're doing, it's great, but it's not sustainable, because you've created something that wasn't needed, and even though you're claiming to be ethical or sustainable, it really isn't in the truest form of that, because that's what nature is. Unless you're completely natural and you're growing something like a farm, or you're creating something that's already naturally there, and you're sustaining that by supporting that mechanism as such, then that's the only way that you can be sustainable. But then, even then, what happens to that product? Where does it go? How does it get transported? Where does it get stored? Is the wastage involved? And so therefore, unless you're growing something and eating it yourself and supporting yourself and maybe supporting your immediate family, or your immediate community, then I don't see how anything is sustainable, especially in a world of globalization. It's not like we've gone out there and recycled and got rid of plastic and reduced food waste, to the sense where we're no longer producing something alongside it which is still harming the planet. Like I said, we went and got rid of plastic straws, but we then went and created more single-use plastic than ever before. Every single pallet of any product that's shipped across the world is covered in single-use cling film plastic, and there's more of it than ever before. So it's not like we've stopped doing stuff and then we've created alternatives. We're creating alternatives alongside the things that are destroying the planet. So we've just become part and parcel of that system. And you look at plant-based products, especially UPS, ultra-processed foods, and you look at the claims that they make around sustainability and ethical and things like allergen free, and some of their the ingredients that they use and how they source them. It's fantastic. But yeah, we're still killing and destroying animals alongside that, and we've not reduced that by any chance. We've just basically built something alongside it. And then you look at the systems that they're involved in, and you look at the way that they store food, and then they transport food, and then they retail or commercialize food. And waste as well. I mean, my shop's currently sat there with loads of Alpro milk that's gone to waste. That's supposedly a sustainable B Corp product, and then next minute it's all being wasted and it gets passed on to us to do something responsible with. But it's still a consequence of that system. So unless we created something that isn't part of that system, which the only other solution I can see is like to be in line with nature, then I don't see how anything is sustainable whatsoever. And I've met with and traveled the world and seen companies and organizations and startups and enterprises across the world, and I've not met anybody yet who's come up with anything that's sustainable, because it's not in line with nature in its truest form. And therefore we may be close to that, and I understand that completely, where people are trying to head towards. And people say a million people doing the right thing is better than one person doing a load of the bad things, which is great, but it's not like we're reducing the other side of the coin. That's what really gets to me. Like, it's not like we're producing less meat, we're destroying less of the planet, we're cutting down less trees, etc. And then there's people over here trying to do the right thing. That's not what's happening. We're just moving alongside this behemoth of destruction and overproduction and everything else that we create on this planet alongside it. And therefore, unfortunately, if anything, some of these services and products that we create are somewhat futile, because the thing alongside it, which is what we're kind of against, is still moving forward at 100 miles an hour. And it's scary to think how much it's still growing in a world where we're also educated around the problems.
Thank you.
That's a short answer.
I just want to say I really admire everything that you've just said, everything you're putting into that. It's very much speaking my language. We have to reconnect to the earth and really look at what we're doing, where it's coming from, how we're impacting that natural system, the balance of that natural system, and such wonderful insights that you bring. And the reason I say it's so admirable the way you've put that, because most people would pat themselves on the back for all of the work that you've achieved and be saying, look how much food waste. And I think that, I will pat you on the back for that, even if you won't, because it is incredible. That part of the story is incredible in itself, because you are taking something that would otherwise be wasted and making sure that it gets into good hands and it's feeding people that wouldn't have that nutrition. So, let's not dismiss that. But I so admire that you're going deeper and you're seeing it all holistically and looking at the system and saying, well, actually, we're producing too much food, and we rarely hear this statistic. So I'm going to kind of ask you to restate that again, that part that, we're producing more food than we need per person every day.
Mm-hmm.
Because we so rarely hear that. And I think that's because of that perpetual need for the system to keep growing. It needs to keep saying we need more food. So if you could just re-highlight that point about how much is being produced.
I mean, my research into it came about, there was a question on a headline of a media outlet that was, how are we going to feed a growing population? And obviously the fact that I'm involved in waste, I was like, hang on a minute, we already waste a load of food that could feed a percentage of that growing population. But then when you look into the stats, it's something around 6,000 calories per person per day is produced on this planet that's either grown or made in products. And it's around half of that, or around 60% of that, goes towards biofuel and animal feed. And then around about 30-40% of it is then diverted to human beings. Approximately half of that food, so around 20% of that, is wasted before it even makes it to our plates. And then the food that we actually do receive, you see in supermarkets and shops and etc. There is also a percentage of that that's waste as well. So the actual amount that actually we consume as a global population that has direct access to any type of food is a very, very small percentage of the actual food that's produced anywhere on the planet, because the vast amount of it is obviously biofuel and animal feed. And if you look into that process as well, regardless of your beliefs, like I keep saying, I am vegan, but if somebody eats meat, so be it. I'm not going to tell somebody not to eat meat. That's their choice. But if you look into the meat system, if you look into how much food we grow that then feeds animals, and then you look at the amount of land that's then needed to support that amount of livestock or animal protein, and then obviously all of them animals are then killed and then turned into products of whatever shape or form. And then if you look at how much of that then is actually consumed of that animal protein from a global population, it's very, very small amount. So we put so much energy and resources and food and water into creating a product which we don't all then eat. There's a growing movement of plant-based movement. There's accessibility. You've got wastage. You've got transport. You've got logistics. You've got all sorts of factors involved that determine where that food ends up. And that's the problem with it. Then when it becomes a meat product, when it becomes a ultra-processed food meat product, what happens to it? Because you can't just put it back into the ground because it never came from the ground. So it then needs to be destroyed or landfilled or anaerobic digestion, etc. So we're growing food to feed to animals, to kill them, to put them into plastic, to throw them in a bin. That's what's happening. So regardless of your viewpoints, there's no kind of getting away from that fact. And that's what really gets to me, is like, if we diverted a small percentage of the food that is grown on this planet, we could feed everybody, regardless of the size of the population. So I just don't buy into this narrative at all that there's a scaremongering going on around. There's a growing population, how we're going to feed them all, when we have overproduction and overabundance of food, and then we have wastage beyond anything we can control on this planet. It just gets moved to one place whenever, until there's an end result, which is usually landfill or anaerobic digestion, or we consume it. And so therefore, I just feel like if there was a change further up the supply chain within the system, a small change, even a small percentage, if 10% of it didn't go to biofuel or animal feed, we could feed the planet. And through the work that I do and the type of food that we get, we just diverted tons and tons of cauliflowers. I think there was 14,000 cauliflowers, about 10 tons of cauliflowers that were going to waste, and we diverted them. In the UK, we have enough going to waste alone to feed everybody, just from the waste that's generated in this country. So it just puts into perspective the amount of food that's available. And all you got to look at, Helen, is when I was younger, I'm 40 this year, you had to travel to go to a supermarket or a shop. Now there is a supermarket on every single corner of every single street. And some of the supermarkets I've seen in the headlines recently are trying to create a new store per week. So that's maybe 50 new stores UK wide. If you look at Aldi and Lidl, for example, they're everywhere. You turn around the corner, there's an Aldi or a Lidl, everywhere in the UK right now. And what people don't associate with that is every single one of them is full of food. And when there's a new one, it gets filled up with food again. So we constantly have so much food available. A lot of it goes to waste, a lot of it is consumed, a lot of it is bought and then wasted. So there isn't a problem with food and how to get access to food and how to be able to feed a population. The problem is that there is a control mechanism in place to make sure that what happens to the food that is grown goes to where it needs to grow to make as much profit as possible. Like I said, first it's biofuel, then it's animal feed, and then it goes to human beings. And I just don't believe for 1 second that we can't feed every single person on this planet, from what I see, both ends of the spectrum, regardless of what we see in the middle, the supermarkets and shops and caterers and hotels, everything that you see that has food, take all them out of the equation, and there's still enough food to feed everybody just from overproduction and waste, which gives you a kind of perspective of just how much is available out there.
It does. It's really interesting that there's such huge numbers and such an interesting perspective that you bring to that. So thank you so much. And I'd like to touch on, before we finish up, the work that you do and what you've learned, because there's so much that you've shared of what you've learned about the food waste. But how about the movement forward? You've clearly gone through a lot, you've experienced a lot, you've seen what doesn't work. You've said that the Real Junk Food Project was impacted by COVID, for example, and how that changed things. You've had a shake-up more recently, I believe. What has this all taught you about what the answer is looking forward, with regards to not being sustainable, but creating something that works?
Exactly, yeah, that's the hardest thing, is because when we started the Real Junk Food Project, it was like, we're going to end food waste and feed the world. And then we started like, wow, there's like millions of people that need us right now and we can't stop it. And I was like, but we need to stay true to why we exist. And the Real Junk Food Project worked off a circular economy model through pay as you feel, and people just didn't understand that concept. We live in a world where we had a conservative government, we had austerity, we had a war in Ukraine, we had a cost of living crisis, etc. So when you're trying to educate people around circular economy, give back time, money, and skills in return for food, unfortunately, people had needs and didn't maybe understand the true value of food, but understand the price of food. And that was really, really difficult for nearly 10 years to get that across. That didn't quite work in that concept. And even though it did amazing things and fed millions and started lots of grassroots organisations across the UK and Europe, we had to change the model to, one, become financially sustainable, because we couldn't do it without that, and always having to beg and borrow to be able to get through the next month. And then we had to create something that was about dignity as well. So we took surplus food, we placed a price on it, and people were more willing to pay for it than they were to come and get it potentially for free, which was really, really, really interesting from my perspective psychologically, because we were trying to give things away that had a high value that people wouldn't take, because it was like, leave it for somebody else that needs it. And as soon as I put a nominal fee on it, whether it was like 10 pence, people came and bought loads of it. So it was really, really interesting. It was like, wow, this is what people want to pay for stuff. Like, they don't want it for free, which was really, really interesting kind of psyche into kind of like human psychology of consumerism and that whole kind of narrative around food waste should be used to feed poor people, where I've gone on for years and years and said we need to separate the two. Food waste has nothing to do with poverty, and vice versa. Poverty is a political thing. They could change it tomorrow. Food waste isn't. You can't just end it tomorrow. It's so complex and vast, and a lot of stakeholders need to be on that table. So we just created a model that was like, how can we create dignity, price up food, which meant we could be sustainable and be there for people that needed us, whilst also providing a service. So we started to change our thinking towards it, of going, actually, if we had shops and supermarkets all over the UK that people used daily for everything, and we've got things like fruit and veg, frozen products, bakery, ambient goods, toys, we get household products, cleaning products, you name it, and they could come to us instead of going to the supermarkets. Could we potentially grow big enough to start challenging the supermarkets from a social enterprise perspective, one that invests and empowers volunteers into positions of employment, pays a living wage, everything goes back into the organisation and the community rather than going into shareholders or CEOs' pockets. And is there room for that? And if there is, and it's dependent upon surplus, then we have to make sure that we control that narrative in the sense where, yes, there is a problem. Yes, I've been saying, we shouldn't be creating companies off the back of problems. But if we could shift supply and demand away from the big six, the retailers, into something that was much more focused into the communities, planets, climate change, all of that stuff, then maybe there's a need for us, and maybe there's a way that we can make the system a bit more responsible and sustainable in the sense that if there is an abundance or waste, then we'll deal with it responsibly as we can. We'll make sure that everybody has access to it in a way that they can afford it with a sense of dignity without having to queue up and kind of justify who they are as a human being. And, you can stand shoulder to shoulder with somebody who is, in need or vulnerable, and then the person next to you has a big flash 4x4 outside. And it was completely irrelevant to us because it was like, this is just about stopping waste and about giving people that dignity and that opportunity to have access to food, because it should be, I believe, food should be free to everybody, no matter what. But we can't do that, and we can't sustainably allow ourselves to keep growing and pay wages and pay for the van and the fuel and everything that comes with the cost of running a project whilst giving stuff away. So we had to come up with something that was what people wanted, and we trialed all sorts of things pre-COVID, during COVID, and then post-COVID. Lots of different models. At one point we weren't allowed to go near each other by 2 meters or whatever it was, and people were not allowed to go out of their homes and stuff. So we had to come up with concepts that worked towards matching those needs. And it just grew and developed, and we kept asking people, what do you want? Do you want a box of food that we deliver to your house for free, or do you want us to, with random stuff in that you might not use, or do you want to come into a shop where you can fill a box with whatever you wanted and pay 10 quid, but sometimes there might not be anything there, so you might waste a trip. And then we got to the point where it was like, well, if you pay for it, we'll guarantee that we'll always have everything, because we can go out and find it, potentially even cover some of the cost for it. As I'm speaking to you now, I've just been offered 2 lorries, one full of ice cream and one full of ambient products, literally just on my emails now. And it's like, we'll go out and find it because we can cover the cost of those 2 lorries. And those 2 lorries might cost us like 500-600 quid. But because you've paid us for this and we've got that reserve to be able to do that, we'll go out and find more products and keep bringing them in and stopping waste and providing you with more products and services that you need. And so that's why Surplus to Purpose came into it. It was like, well, that seems like a more, dare I say, sustainable way of building a business off the back of a problem in a world where I, argue against it, passionately argue against that we shouldn't have companies like us around. But there is a need and a space for us right now to do what we do until there comes a times where we're not needed, or we are needed to the point where we have to sit around that table and play a major part in the discussion around food and food accessibility and supply chain management, production and seasonality and sustainability, everything that's involved in food. We need to be sat around that table and saying, look, we may have millions of people accessing us on a daily basis. And so therefore you may need to look at how you support these kind of much more local, sustainable food systems that are much about the communities rather than about the shareholders. And maybe even then we'll have a huge reduction in waste, because if we can shift supply and demand away from the retailers, they're going to start to need to look at how they access food and how they supply food and the wastage. They won't be able to afford to have so much wastage in their systems if a lot less people were shopping with them because there was an alternative. And I just think right now in this world, there isn't an alternative for people. You either go to one supermarket or the other. So we want to become part of that alternative if possible and create a whole new ecosystem. And I'm not saying it has to just be us and Surplus to Purpose. We want to collaborate and share and support other organisations, working cooperatives, local grocers, etc. To create those kind of local food economies and sustainable ecosystems. We want to be part of that world where we're not massively dependent on a massive 24-hour supermarket.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Your passion and your dedication come through so clearly, and the work that you're doing is phenomenal. I think that the scale that you've achieved and the drive that you have to keep pushing on and going past the obstacles is wonderful. So congratulations for everything you've done. Thank you for sharing. And if you could leave us with maybe a few bits and pieces, because I know that you've got so many resources out there, so much information about the work that you've done. If there's a few bits you'd like to highlight, please go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, the shop for us is obviously fundamental to what we do. We have a little shop now. We used to have a big shop, but we have a little shop now in Bradford, which supports the local community. But you can purchase online from us. You can volunteer with us. You can volunteer as part of a kind of corporate day, so within your work group as well. That's all done through our website. And we've got an amazing community now of about 50 staff and volunteers that work there 7 days a week. Also suppliers as well, so we travel nationally and European wide to get access to surplus stock, and it doesn't just have to be food, it can be absolutely anything. We deal with toys and household products and everything you can think of, really. And we're just there to work with people to support them when there's a time where stock is difficult to manage. And we'll do something as responsibly as we can with it. We've got a great social media presence, but we're also sensitive as well, so if things need to be done sometimes out of public view, which we're very good at, and we have to deal with a lot of that for different reasons, then we can do that as well. So yeah, we're very, very good at what we do. We've been doing it a long time now. So if people want to get in touch or involved, then they can do simply through our website, and they can find out how they can support us, but also how we can work with them as well.
Thank you. Fantastic. Well, thank you so much for spending this time with us and sharing. It's been really very insightful, and I'll let you get back to that important work, checking on the lorries and keeping things moving. But thank you very much.
Thanks for having me, Helen. Cheers.
If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to check the description for the links to learn more and engage with the work from Adam and Surplus to Purpose. Adam has shared much about his inspirational story over the years, so you'll find plenty of resources for getting to know him more. Don't forget to subscribe to keep up to date. I'm Helen Fisher. This is We Are Carbon, and let's keep figuring this all out together.